My name's Amy Johnson. I'm a conservation biologist at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, and I run Virginia Working Landscapes. So Virginia Working Landscapes is a research-based program, and we collaborate with a network of over 150 private landowners, community volunteers, as well as regional partners to study our region's native biodiversity. And we do that by working with landowners and learning how land management practices are influencing biodiversity. So our grassland birds, our pollinators, bumblebees, even our soils and our native and invasive plant communities.
Bert Harris, I'm the Executive Director of the Clifton Institute, and we are a nonprofit organization that works on environmental education, ecological restoration, and research. Last year we had about 1,600 kids and 600 adults come through the field station for our environmental education programs on a 900-acre property here in central Fauquier County, and the property is about half forest and half fields of different ages. So we have everything from grasslands that are disturbed every year to shrublands that are disturbed every 3 or so years, to young forests and mature forests.
So this year we partnered with American Farmland Trust to start a project focused on sustainable grazing and looking at how sustainable grazing practices can benefit grassland bird nesting success. So grassland birds have declined by more than 70% since the 1970s, and reasons that are causing that are things like pesticide use, agricultural intensification, so really intensive grazing practices can impact grassland birds, insect decline, habitat fragmentation and loss. But what we've also learned from doing research in the region is that grazing animals and grassland birds can coexist very well as long as certain practices are followed. And so through this sustainable grazing project started by American Farmland Trust, we're actually able to study which of these practices work well with grassland bird conservation.
So this summer we have surveyed 35 sites across 5 counties to learn what Piedmont grasslands look like. And these are all sites that have not been planted with any seeds. And so really the first step in our grassland restoration work here at Clifton is learning about what these grasslands would have looked like before people were here. And we now have a good sense, after this summer's project, we have a good sense of what species are here, and we've gotten it down to about 20 species that we recommend for, in general, for plantings for wildflower meadows in our area. So we're giving out those recommendations, and we're also doing a grassland restoration experiment in our 100-acre pasture to find out, to compare different methods of establishment and management and see how that relates to successful establishment of native grasslands. So we're especially focused on species that are not doing well across North America. So species like grasshopper sparrows, eastern meadowlarks, those are grassland species, and shrubland species like prairie warblers and field sparrows. So we are trying to create high quality habitat for all of those species. We use prescribed fire, we use mowing, and we also use cattle grazing to maintain those habitats.
So some of the projects that we've worked on in the past are looking at how land management practices influence our wintering bird communities. We often think about how we can support our birds during the breeding season, but the wintering birds are at a very, very vulnerable time in their annual cycle, and we actually host a lot of wintering birds right here in Virginia. So we've been learning about the importance of meadows like this, where there's a lot of native species that can provide a lot of resources and cover for these birds while they're here in the winter. So some of our region's grassland birds, like eastern meadowlarks, have declined by more than 70%. And some of the reasons that are contributing to this are earlier and more frequent haying, intensive grazing, or agricultural intensification, the use of pesticides, habitat fragmentation, and also habitat loss. And with the work that American Farmland Trust is doing, they are using the land in a way that's beneficial to both the cattle as well as the soils and a lot of other biodiversity. So specifically, we're looking at how these birds are able to successfully nest in fields that are concurrently being managed through the Sustainable Grazing Project.
In the grasslands, we're focused on grasshopper sparrows, eastern meadowlarks, and American kestrels, and all 3 of those species are declining across North America. And all three actually seem to coexist quite well with cattle. So we are using cows to maintain the kind of grasslands that those species require. But if you're able to cut the hay earlier or graze earlier, and then let the pasture rest and stockpile fescue for later in the season, that seems to be a win-win, where you're able to still produce off of the land, but also let the grassland birds breed.
So here at Chancellor's Rock, we had several different field treatments that we could look at. So for example, we had one field that was grazed early in the season, and then the cattle were removed for stockpiling for winter grazing. We also had a field that was hayed early in the season, so hayed before June 1st, so we could get that early first cutoff. And then we held off for the second cut until after July 15th. So this offers a really nice wide window for birds to successfully nest. And then the third treatment was a field that was continuously grazed by a low number of cattle. And what we found from this farm, as well as all of the other farms that we were studying, is that a treatment with an early graze, so the cows are on the field early in the season, maybe they're there from March through the middle of May and taken off, it promotes excellent structure and cover for nesting grassland birds, and we had the highest number of birds successfully fledge young from the fields that were set aside for winter stockpiling. So this is all bee balm, or monarda. This is a great pollinator wildflower, and it smells really minty fresh. But there's seeds inside of this monarda that'll feed the birds throughout the winter. So underneath a field of these native grasses is actually pretty open. It's almost like a whole collection of caves and tunnels where birds and other animals can move around, but they're also protected from overhead predators like hawks. So some of the grassland birds that overwinter here in these fields specifically are our eastern meadowlarks, our bobwhite quail that have declined by over 80%. They rely on habitats like this to keep them protected throughout the winter months and also to raise their young during the spring.
So broadly we have nearly 200 bird species that have been found on the property. So it's a really diverse place. And we also provide nest boxes for cavity nesting species. So our main focus in terms of that is the American kestrel, which is declining across the Northeast, in part due to the lack of good nest sites in competition with non-native European starlings. So we put up about 12 nest boxes 2 years ago, and in the first year we had 4 occupied boxes, and this year we had 6 occupied boxes. If you have a big field, if you have a cattle pasture or a big hay field, then it's worth putting up a kestrel box. And really the only responsibility that you have when you put up nest boxes is to make sure you clean them out every year. And also, if you get non-native species like house sparrows or starlings nesting in the boxes, you want to clean those nests out as soon as you can so that these non-native species don't reproduce and compete with the birds we're trying to help. So our objective is biodiversity conservation at the Clifton Institute, and we're trying to help these grassland species. And the reason we are including cattle in the way we are managing our grasslands to help native species is for a couple of reasons. So for one thing, the grasslands in the Piedmont were partially maintained by grazing from bison. And so by introducing the cattle back to these fields, we're mimicking the disturbance caused by bison. And that's important because there are quite a few flowers that don't compete very well with the grasses unless they get that particular kind of disturbance caused by grazing and by wallowing. So that's one reason why we're working with cattle. Cattle are also going to help us create the kind of grassland that we need for species that need short grass, like grasshopper sparrows and even Henslow sparrows, which is one we would love to attract. But I also wanted to mention that we are still going to be maintaining some fescue pastures of significant size, and that's going to help us graze throughout the year, just about minimize how much hay we're feeding. And also some of the species that we're trying to help, like bobolinks, actually do well in cool season pastures, even though those grasses are not native to our area. So we're really going to be using a combination of forages to meet our biodiversity conservation objectives.